A man stood up in the audience and said, "Mr. Carson, I need to confess something to you." And for the first time in 30 years, Johnny Carson didn't know what to say. It was March 1985. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Studio 6B at NBC in Burbank. A Thursday night taping. The familiar rhythm, Johnny's monologue, the audience laughter, Ed McMahon's booming chuckle from his chair beside the desk, Doc Severinsen and the band ready with bumper music. Johnny was in the middle of a joke about the weather in Los Angeles. Something about how Californians think 60 degrees is a cold front. The audience was laughing. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly what America expected when they tuned in at 11:30. And then a voice cut through the laughter. "Mr. Carson." Johnny stopped mid-sentence. The smile stayed on his face, but his eyes scanned the audience. Someone had spoken during his monologue. That almost never happened. "Mr. Carson, I need to confess something to you." The voice came from the third row. A man was standing. Middle-aged, maybe late 40s. He wore a worn brown jacket over a simple shirt. Working-class clothes. Not the usual Tonight Show audience attire. His face was weathered, lined with years that looked harder than they should have been. The audience around him had gone quiet. The cameras swung to find him, unsure if this was planned. Johnny set down his cue cards carefully. "Well," he said, his tone still light but cautious. "Confession is good for the soul. What's on your mind?" The man's hands gripped the seat back in front of him. His knuckles were white. When he spoke again, his voice trembled. "My name is Robert Hendricks. I'm a Vietnam veteran. And 15 years ago, you saved my life. But you don't know it. And I never thanked you." The studio went completely silent. That night on The Tonight Show, a man stood up and said, "Mr. Carson, I need to confess something to you." And Johnny Carson, who had hosted for 30 years without ever being speechless, didn't know what to say. Johnny's professional smile faded. He leaned forward slightly, both hands now resting flat on his desk. "I'm sorry, I don't think we've met." "Are you sure you have the right?" "We've never met," Robert interrupted, his voice stronger now. "But in 1970, I was sitting in a hospital in San Diego." Walter Reed. "I'd been back from Vietnam for 3 months. I had no legs below the knees. I had no future. And I had a bottle of pills in my hand." The audience gasped. Ed McMahon shifted in his seat, his jovial expression gone, replaced by something solemn. Johnny didn't move. He just watched Robert, waiting. "I was going to take those pills," Robert continued. "All of them. I'd written letters to my family. I'd made my peace with God. I was done. And then the nurse turned on the television in my room. The Tonight Show came on. And you told a joke." Robert's voice cracked. Tears began to stream down his face, but he kept talking. It wasn't even a particularly funny joke. Something about Nixon. But I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in 6 months. And then you told another joke. And I laughed again. And for the next 90 minutes I watched you. I listened to you talk to your guests. I heard Ed laugh. I heard the band play. And somewhere during that show, I put the pills down. The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the stage lights. I didn't take them that night," Robert said. "Or the next night. Or the night after that. Because every night at 11:30, The Tonight Show came on. And every night you made me laugh. You made me remember that there was still something worth living for. Even if it was just a stupid joke about the president." Carson stopped mid-monologue. The entire studio froze. Johnny sat perfectly still behind his desk. His hands were still flat on the wood surface. His eyes were locked on Robert Hendricks standing in the third row. Slowly, deliberately, Johnny pushed back his chair and stood up. The cameras followed him as he walked out from behind the desk. He gestured to Doc Severinsen and the band. The universal sign for silence. No music. No sound. He walked to the edge of the stage, to the point where it met the audience seating. Robert was still standing in the third row, tears on his face, hands gripping the chair in front of him. "Come here," Johnny said quietly. Not a request. An invitation. Robert hesitated. The people sitting around him shifted to let him through. He moved slowly, carefully, his gait uneven, the slight hitch in his step that spoke of prosthetics under his pants legs. He made his way down to the stage edge. Johnny reached out his hand. Robert took it. And Johnny Carson, in front of 300 studio audience members and millions of viewers at home, helped a Vietnam veteran climb onto the Tonight Show stage. The audience started to applaud, but Johnny held up his other hand. The applause died immediately. He wanted silence. He wanted this moment to be heard, not drowned in noise. Johnny guided Robert to the guest chair, the famous chair where countless celebrities had sat. Robert lowered himself into it carefully, his prosthetic legs making the movement awkward. Johnny sat in the chair beside him. Not behind his desk. Beside him. Equal. "Robert," Johnny said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Tell me about Vietnam." And Robert Hendricks, who had carried 15 years of gratitude and guilt and survival, began to talk. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Robert told his story. Not the sanitized version. Not the heroic narrative. The real one. He'd been 22 when he shipped out to Vietnam in 1968. A kid from Nebraska who'd been drafted and didn't know what else to do. He'd served with the 1st Cavalry Division. He'd seen combat. He'd lost friends. And in December 1969, his transport convoy hit a landmine outside Pleiku. The explosion killed 3 men instantly. Robert survived, but his legs didn't. He came home to a country that didn't want to hear about Vietnam. To protesters who called him baby killer. To a VA system overwhelmed and underfunded. To a family that tried to understand but couldn't. To a future that looked like nothing but pain and wheelchairs and pity. "I was so angry," Robert said, his voice raw. "Angry at the army for sending me. Angry at the war for taking my legs. Angry at America for not caring. Angry at myself for surviving when better men died." Johnny listened without interrupting. Ed McMahon, visible in the background, had tears streaming down his face. "And then that night in the hospital," Robert continued, "I was going to end it. I'd decided. The pain was too much. The future was too empty. And then you came on the television and you made a joke about Nixon's dog. Something stupid. Something completely meaningless. And I laughed." He looked at Johnny directly. "You didn't know I existed. You were just doing your job. Making jokes. Entertaining America. But you saved my life. That night and every night after. Because I started waiting for the Tonight Show. I started looking forward to 11:30. I started thinking, I can make it one more day to see what Johnny says tonight." Johnny's jaw was clenched tight. His eyes were wet. In 30 years of hosting The Tonight Show, through thousands of guests and millions of jokes, he had never looked like this. Vulnerable. Human. Stripped of the professional armor. "And after a while," Robert said, "I started doing more than just waiting for your show. I started going to physical therapy because I wanted to be strong enough to sit up and watch. I started talking to other vets in the hospital because we'd watch together. I started thinking maybe there was something beyond just surviving until the next episode." He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I got my prosthetics fitted. I learned to walk again. I left the hospital. I got a job at a factory. I met a woman named Sarah. We got married. We have 2 kids now. Teenagers. And every night for 15 years, at 11:30, I've watched The Tonight Show. Because you remind me why I'm still here." The studio audience was crying now. Not polite tears. Deep, body-shaking sobs. Ed McMahon had his head in his hands. Doc Severinsen had set down his trumpet, and was wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. Johnny reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his pocket square. He handed it to Robert. "I don't know what to say," Johnny admitted, his voice hoarse. I tell jokes. I talk to movie stars. I never thought." "You didn't have to think about it," Robert said. "You just had to show up. Every night. Be there. Make people laugh. That's what saved me. Not because you were trying to save anyone, but because you were just there." Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny stood up. He walked back to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled something out. A blue cue card. One of the hundreds he used every show, covered in his own handwriting, jokes, interview questions, notes to himself. He walked back to Robert and held it out. "This is from tonight's monologue," Johnny said. "The joke about the weather in California. The one I was telling when you stood up." He turned the card over. On the back, in pen, he wrote something quickly. Then he handed it to Robert. Robert looked at it. The front had Johnny's handwritten joke. The back now had a message. "Robert Hendricks, thank you for staying. Johnny Carson, March 1985 inch. I want you to keep this," Johnny said, "because I need you to understand something. You thanked me for saving your life. But you just reminded me why I do this job. It's not about the ratings. It's not about the celebrities. It's about showing up for people like you. People who need to laugh. People who need to know they're not alone." Johnny's voice broke. "So thank you, Robert. For staying. For fighting. For being here tonight to tell me this. Because I needed to hear it more than you know. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming." Johnny turned to the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to do something I've never done in 30 years. I'm going to ask you for help." He gestured to Robert. "This man is a Vietnam veteran. There are thousands more like him. Men who came home from a war this country wanted to forget. Men who sacrificed everything and got nothing but scorn and broken promises in return. They need our help. They need jobs. They need medical care. They need someone to give a damn." Johnny looked directly into camera one. "If you're watching this at home, and you're a Vietnam veteran who's struggling, I want you to know something. You're not alone. You're not forgotten. And there are people who care." He turned back to Robert. "Stand up." Robert stood, using the chair arm for support. Johnny stood beside him. And then Johnny Carson, the king of late-night television, put his arm around a veteran's shoulders and faced the audience. "Stand up," Johnny said to the studio. "All of you." 300 people rose as one. The applause started, not the performative applause of television, but something deeper. A standing ovation that went on for 3 full minutes while Johnny and Robert stood together on that stage, two men from completely different worlds united by survival and gratitude. When the applause finally died, Johnny helped Robert back to his seat. "Where do you live, Robert?" "About 40 miles from here. Riverside." "How did you get here tonight?" "I drove. Took me 2 hours in traffic." Johnny nodded. "Ed, call transportation. Get Robert a car service home tonight. Door to door." Ed was already on the phone. Johnny sat down behind his desk. He looked at his scattered cue cards, suddenly meaningless. He looked at the cameras, at America watching from living rooms across the country. "We're going to take a commercial break," he said, his voice steadier now. "When we come back, I don't know. I haven't decided yet. Maybe we'll do the show. Maybe we won't. But right now I need a minute." The red light on camera one went dark. Commercial break. But the cameras kept rolling backstage. They captured Johnny sitting at his desk, head in his hands. They captured Ed walking over and putting a hand on his shoulder. They captured Robert sitting in the guest chair, still holding that blue cue card like it was sacred. When they came back from commercial, Johnny didn't do the rest of the show. He canceled the scheduled guests. He sat and talked with Robert for another 20 minutes about Vietnam, about survival, about why laughter matters when everything else fails. The network didn't air most of it. Too raw. Too real. Too unlike television. But Johnny kept that night close for the rest of his career. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Robert Hendricks framed the cue card. It hung in his living room until he died in 2019 at age 73, surrounded by his wife, children, and grandchildren. In his will, he donated it to the Smithsonian. It sits there now, beside Johnny Carson's desk and microphone. A blue card with a joke about California weather on one side and a thank you note on the other. A reminder that sometimes saving a life is as simple as showing up and making someone laugh at 11:30 p.m. Johnny never forgot Robert. And Robert never missed The Tonight Show until the day Johnny retired in 1992. They saved each other. They just didn't know it until that March night in 1985 when a veteran stood up and said thank you.